Different people look at the same situation and see it differently. What you see and what you choose to look at and how what you look at makes you respond are all important. Let me illustrate with a story about our dog, Elsie. Now, she's now 13 years old, so she's getting a bit older and slower on our walks. And when she was a puppy, she used to pull on the lead all the time, but now it's the other way around. We're kind of dragging her along on the walks. And the other day, she was walking slowly and wheezing as she does up a hill, trying to keep up, when she saw ahead of us a wallaby or a paddymmelon, and she instantly changed. She looked like a puppy again. I think she grew 2 or 3 centimetres, she doubled her pace, and she looked sprightly, and she was bouncing around, and she was suddenly ahead of me rather than behind me on the walk. There was a spring in her step, and she moved with purpose toward her goal. We both saw the same wallaby, but her interpretation of what that meant was different to mine. And her interpretation dramatically changed her attitude to life. So what do you look at? And do you look at the things that motivate you to act like a puppy again, or things that perhaps do the opposite sometimes? You can be tired, and you can feel old, and at times you just can't be bothered. But if you look at the right thing, or if you look at something a particular way, you can get a new spring in your step. You can regain motivation and purpose. A few months ago, during National Airport Safety Week, a group of airport stakeholders came together to make a video with people and airport vehicles out on the runway. There weren't many planes landing at that stage in the middle of the COVID crisis, so it was quite easy to find some time where we could put a bunch of vehicles on the runway. Now, this was about saying that all the stakeholders were together and supporting each other during the COVID crisis. And here is the video. Plus it doesn't sound too nice. Now I was out there, and I'm sure you noticed me, and as we were walking back to the vehicle that we were driven out in, after we had that group shot of all the people at the front of the vehicles, one particular guy was sprinting along the runway back to the vehicle that he was going to. And at that stage I happened to be walking next to a couple of ambulance officers, and one of them said, "Oh no, someone's running. It makes me nervous when someone runs." Now I saw the guy running, and I know he's a runner. He's a good runner. He runs a few times a week and long distances. So I suspected that he was just enjoying the opportunity to run along the runway. But the ambo, if someone runs when it's not an appropriate place to run or not expected that they would be running, then they think there's some kind of emergency and suddenly they're going to be called into action. So her response was very different to mine. And it's obvious that if you're on a runway and you're a runner, that you'd want to run. People look at the same situation and have very different responses. And sometimes the way we look at something can bring significant change to our motivation or our feelings. So today I'm going to talk about a few things that Jesus looked at and saw differently to the people around him. I'm going to talk about a few things that Jesus and the Bible writers tell us as followers of Jesus to look at. But first I want to give you 3 places or ways not to look. So this is a 9-point sermon. 3 places not to look, 3 places Jesus looked, and 3 places we should look. First one of the 3 places or ways not to look is don't look back. The Gospel of Luke includes a few verses in chapter 9 where people reject Jesus' call to follow him because they consider the price or the cost of that following is too high. One person said to Jesus, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family." And Jesus replied, "No one who puts a hand to the plough and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God." Now Jesus here was saying something much broader than one example of saying goodbye to family. He was saying that if we choose to follow him, we must not look back with some sort of regret or longing for our past life when we weren't following Jesus. We're not to look back to our old way of life. In Jesus' time, a plough was often pulled by oxen. But if the man controlling the oxen looked back instead of forward, they were likely to go off course. So we are to keep looking forward, looking ahead, looking towards the life that Jesus offers us. We mustn't waver in our commitment. In another place, Jesus warns his followers not to be deceived into following someone else other than him. We are to look to him. The organisation that I run statewide that puts pastoral carers into evacuation centres in times of emergencies is a multi-faith program. And in that context, a few months ago, I came across a spiritual leader who lives in Queensland who claims to be Jesus. If you look at his website, he looks like a nice guy, he looks like a normal guy, and when you read the blurb next to his photo, he says he first arrived on planet Earth 2,000 years ago, as the Jesus of the Bible. And his wife today in Queensland was also on Earth 2,000 years ago, and her name back then was Mary Magdalene. But we are not to look to someone else. We are not to look back. The real Jesus said he is the Messiah. And we don't need to go looking anywhere else. There are other verses that talk about looking forward to our reward in him and looking forward to the day when Jesus comes again. We have to look forward, not look back. Secondly, don't look twice. And this is in the context of sin. And crossing the road, or not crossing the road. Oh, look twice. What's the rule? Look 3 times. Thank you. Just clarify that. 2 Samuel 11 tells the story of King David and Bathsheba. King David was walking around the palace roof one night because he couldn't sleep, and from his high vantage point, he saw a lady called Bathsheba taking a bath. He ended up committing adultery with her, and then arranging for her husband to be placed on the front line of the army so he'd be killed in battle. Now, where did David go wrong? If King David was on the roof, walking around and looking around and happened to notice someone having a bath, then there's nothing wrong with that. Our eyes see all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons. Where King David went wrong was that he had a second look. And then obviously a third, and more. The problem was he looked twice. Don't look twice at sin or temptation. If you're trying to lose weight and you happen to see something unhealthy in the pantry or the fridge, I looked at you, Tim, when I said that. Why is that? Just don't look twice. If you happen to see something unhealthy in the pantry or the fridge, don't take a second look. The first look is in a sense not your fault. These things happen. But you can control whether or not you take a second look. Don't look twice. If you're searching for something on the internet and an unwholesome ad pops up, you might not be able to control the first look, but you can control whether or not you take a second.
That's right. Yeah.
Don't look twice at temptation or sin. Choose to walk away instead. Thirdly, don't look to your own interests alone. Philippians 2 says, "Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but also each of you to the interests of the others. We are here to serve others, to care for others, to value and to promote others. We're not to neglect our own interests, but we are to look to the interests of others as well, not just our own. Selfishness has no place in the kingdom of God. Many of us are in a privileged position with the resources we have in life, and we have a responsibility to help others with what we have been given. So there are 3 places not to look. If you do a word study in the Bible on the word look, you will find others too, such as don't look for the praise of men. Don't look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye when you have a plank in your own. It's an interesting study to do, but we'll move on and look at 3 ways that Jesus looked and how he saw things differently. The first thing is that Jesus looked at people. When Jesus looked at people, he saw them differently to how the people around him saw them. He went beyond cultural norms and cultural barriers to really connect with individuals. A good example of this is when Jesus met a woman at a well. Jesus was at the well when a Samaritan woman came to draw water. Now, according to the cultural norms, Jesus should not have spoken to a woman, and Jesus should not have spoken to a Samaritan. So there were 2 reasons for Jesus not to talk to the woman. But he had a desire to connect with people and to share his truth with them, and to share God's power with them. So he chose to give higher priority to the lady's need to hear the truth than he did to the cultural norms and the barriers. This is how the exchange started. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." When his disciples returned, they were amazed to find Jesus talking to a woman. This was not normal behaviour for the place and time. But Jesus saw people differently. There are many examples of this in the Bible. On one occasion, Jesus looked up and saw rich people and a poor widow putting gifts into the temple treasury. And he made an observation about the value of the poor widow's offering because of the sacrifice that she was making. She gave all that she had to live on. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that everyone else observing these happenings were impressed with the large offerings of the rich donors and probably didn't even notice the small offerings of the widow, or perhaps even looked down on her for her small offering. But Jesus saw people differently. And today, Jesus continues to see people differently. In addition to looking at people, Jesus also looks for people. In Mark chapter 5, there's a story of a lady who had been suffering from bleeding for 12 years. The lady thought if she can just touch the cloak that Jesus is wearing, then she would be healed. So she pushed through the crowd and did just that. Jesus felt the power had gone out of him, but didn't initially know who had touched him. He asked his disciples, no one seemed to know. And then the Bible says, but Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Jesus kept looking for the person in order to connect with them. He eventually found her and said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." This reminds me of a verse from the Old Testament, from 2 Chronicles 16:9, which says, "The eyes of the Lord search the whole earth in order to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him." God is active in strengthening and encouraging those who reach out to him and are committed to him. Jesus is looking for people in order to connect with them. And the third place that Jesus looked was at the temple. He was drawn to the temple, the meeting place with God as a child, and he frequented there as an adult. Mark 11:11 says that Jesus went to the temple courts when he arrived in Jerusalem on one occasion, and he looked around at everything. But it was late in the day, so he went to a place called Bethany, and then the next day he went back to the temple and drove out people who were buying and selling goods in the temple courts. Jesus' concern was that the temple was to be a place of prayer for all nations, not a marketplace. But more than that, it's believed that the priests were actually making a profit from the trading that was occurring there, and that the poor were being taken advantage of as they tried to buy animals for the temple sacrifices. Plenty of other people saw the trade happening in the temple courts every day and probably just accepted it. But Jesus saw deeper than the superficial appearance and did something to bring positive change where there was injustice. He looked beyond the obvious of what everyone could see and addressed the real issue. And there are three ways Jesus and the Bible tell us to look. We are to look to the fields. In John 4:35, Jesus tells his disciples that the fields are ripe for harvest. Not the fields of crops, but the fields of people. He said, "Don't you have a saying, it's still 4 months until harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest." Now this is recorded in John chapter 4, and it comes immediately after the story about Jesus meeting the woman at the well. In the exchange with the woman, she talks about physical water, but Jesus goes deeper and talks about spiritual thirst and spiritual or living water to quench that thirst. Then immediately afterwards, the disciples talk about physical food, because I think maybe someone bought some food for Jesus to eat. But Jesus goes deeper and talks not about the physical crops in the fields that might produce food to eat, but the harvest of souls ready to receive his truth. Jesus had just transformed a lady's life by introducing her to his life-giving water. And this is a lady whom the disciples would have ignored due to cultural norms and barriers. Jesus is saying to them, look around. Open your eyes to the fact that the harvest is ripe. People need to hear the truth, and people are open to hear the truth. So we are to look at the harvest. The fields are ripe. And this leads to the second place we are to look for the lost. Matthew 18:12. Jesus said, "What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go out to look for the one that is lost?" Lost people matter to God, and they should matter to us. That is something that we should be looking for. I'm astounded that some Christians won't have anything to do with certain people from other faiths because they're different, or they view them as somehow polluted, or some other strange thing. I have some wonderful connections with people of other faiths. Last year I spoke at the Hobart Mosque. And my message was not that all religious roads lead to Rome, but rather my message was, I'm a Christian, And there are major theological differences between what I believe and what you believe here at the mosque. But we can still work together for people in our community. We're stronger together. Maybe you know someone or know of someone whom you could reach out to. Someone who is outside God's kingdom. Someone whom Jesus is actually seeking out and looking for. And looking for us to be part of that process because he wants to connect with them at a deep level. And finally, and perhaps obviously, we are to look to God. There are many verses in the Bible that say Jesus looked up to heaven as a sign that he was looking to his Father. And Jesus is our example that we should be following. Mark 7:34 says, Jesus looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. That was when he was healing a deaf man. In Luke 9:16, it says, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. Again, Jesus looked up to heaven. He had this habit, if you look through the scriptures, of in public gatherings like that, he'd look to heaven. He'd make a point of showing the fact that he's looking to his Father in heaven. And if we look to Jesus, we see God. Jesus said in John 12:45, the one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me. Go the music back, please. Thank you. So let's look to him, our provider, our sustainer, our comforter, our healer, our hope. Let's look to Jesus. Let's look to God.